So as we begin this recording, let's understand that this video is about how to understand and do Cornell notes. But at the same time, I think it's important for students to hear and parents to hear the purpose behind Cornell notes. Otherwise, it just seems like a lot of busy work, and that's truly not what Cornell notes are about. These are, and I have found them personally to be, a powerful tool for learning. And so as we begin, let me talk about the why. Cornell notes were designed for the purpose of helping students to begin to understand their notes better after they left the class, as well as to make connections with other aspects of their studies, whether it be other classes or within their same class. And at the same time, if they're used properly, students are not just simply writing things down in class as they traditionally did, taking them home and never looking at them, but Cornell notes now become an interactive thing, that they're done in class, they're interacted with in the process of rereading those notes and making connections to those notes. And so each time that you are rereading it and you're making more of those connections and more of those interactions, what you're doing is you're beginning to understand it and learn it. I want you to just think of, for instance, how you learn a song. You might listen to the radio on the way home from school or on the way to work or home from work, and you are listening to a song, and you hear that song, say, 2 or 3 times a day. And as you hear that song more often, and you enjoy that song so much, of course, you begin to sing along with it. And as you sing along with it more and you practice that more because you continue to hear it day in, day out, what happens is you eventually have learned that song. You know all of the places where the singer pauses. You know all the places where the inflection changes. And what you've done is you've essentially done what Cornell notes are trying to encourage students to do with the information they gather in class. Practice it. To practice it in a different way, because you can't practice with text in the same way that you would practice with a song or with lines from a movie, for instance. So as you understand that, as we begin to explain what Cornell notes, how they work exactly, keep in mind the purpose behind this, because otherwise it's going to perhaps seem like a lot of busy work, which is not what it truly is. So this is what a typical piece of notebook paper is going to look like in terms of the pieces and the parts of Cornell notes. Notice that when we start here, this notebook paper, typical college-ruled notebook paper, and it's got a top line. It usually has a margin on the side. It's usually pink. I didn't put that here, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we always start by putting our name, date, and period in the upper right-hand corner. And students, remember that in my class, if you fail to put your name, date, and period on your paper, you will get no points for it. It will go up on the no-name wall, otherwise known as the wall of shame, and you will have to pull that paper down, put your name on it, put it in the makeup work basket. But the problem is you'll only get half credit. So this is the first thing you do always when you are starting a set of notes. Put your name, date, and period on it. Then we're going to go to the next step, and that is probably in the first screen you're going to see for your notes, you're going to see a title of those notes. Make sure that you write down that title clearly. It should be sitting on top of that top line, not sitting somewhere up here floating in space. Right below that, you're going to write the essential question. Now, there are times when maybe your notes don't come with a title and you have to make your own, or they don't come with an essential question, in which case you're going to have to design your own. But the essential question, in my class, the essential question is always given, but if you don't have an essential question, you wouldn't want to actually create one until you were done with the notes, because you really wouldn't understand what question to ask if you didn't have the information that's in the notes. So as we begin taking notes in class, what we're doing is called note-taking. And note-taking is something that goes on the right-hand side of the paper. So again, look at where the title is. This whole right-hand side here, this whole area is where your notes go. This is called note-taking. You are taking notes. And when you take notes, it's important to remember that you are skipping lines between subtopics and lines within the subtopics, using bullet points, using all those methods of organization as you go, that your note should be neat. And yes, you're going to have to learn, and I know parents, sometimes this is one of those things that you look at and you're going, well, my kid can't write that neatly. Okay, well, I understand that. We all have trouble with writing neatly at times. But it's really important that students understand that the quality of their writing, the neatness of their writing, people are going to judge them based upon that. And they're going to look at that writing and make a determination of the ability and skill of the person to some extent. Now, I'm going to have to obviously set that aside for the most part, but students remember this, parents remember this is very simple, that if I can't read it, then you can't get a grade. And you may be asked to rewrite it. So it's important that you are being neat about your work. Now, as we finish our note-taking, let's say that we're done with all of our note-taking. We've spent 2 days taking notes, and we've got our note-taking done. The next step is going to be note-making. Now, note-making can happen whenever you are finished with your notes, but also even in the middle of your notes. Let's say, for instance, we finish day 1, we finish a page and a half of notes. You could go home and do some note-making. And then when we finish the rest of the notes, you can go home and do some note-making. Sometimes there's time in class to do note-making. But what note-making is basically rereading your notes. And as you reread your notes, you're adding information. You're circling key terms, underlining subtopics, highlighting main ideas. It's important before you begin your note-making to make a key in the upper left-hand corner. And students, I'm going to ask you to physically, when you do this, to write key terms, subtopics, and main ideas, I want you to physically circle the words key terms. So you know, whenever I see a key term in my notes, I'm going to circle it in orange. And whenever I see, for instance, a subtopic, I'm going to underline my subtopics in purple. And whenever I see a main idea, I'm going to highlight my main idea in yellow. And so I want the key to physically look like this. Not just simply to write next to it a color dot or to write the words circle it, but to physically circle it. So you can remind yourself, I look at my notes, these are the things that I do to my notes. As I read through my notes, I am adding information. I'm remembering things that were discussed in class, examples that were given, and so on. Maybe I'm thinking of things that I learned 2 weeks ago in class that are now important and connected with this, and I might add that information to my notes to make my notes more complete. Maybe I spend some time with another student, and with that student, what I do is I compare my notes and I begin to understand that maybe there's some things that I'm missing, in which case I need to add information. As I go, I'm circling key terms. Now, these are terms that are important for me to know in order for me to understand the notes. So we don't want to just circle every single word in there that would appear to be some sort of important word. That's not the idea. It's words that would appear to be important specifically for understanding that particular set of notes. It may be a word that we learned in the past, but if we learned it in the past, you don't need to circle it because of the fact that you already know it. So one other thing about key terms, these are words that you need to know in order to understand the notes, but they might also be words that you don't know what they are. So you can't understand the notes unless you know what they mean. Subtopics are rather easy to find. So for instance, we write down the title of the notes. That's not a subtopic. You think of the subtopics as kind of like the chapters of a book. The title of the notes is the name of the book. The subtopics are the chapters in the book, the main divisions of the book. And so you want to underline those subtopics. I did mine up here in purple. And then you want to highlight main ideas. Now, main ideas are phrases or sentences. They're not terms. So if you're highlighting individual words, maybe those are words you should have circled, but you shouldn't be highlighting them. So be careful how you do these things. You don't want to circle every other word, and you don't want to underline a large number of things, and you don't want to highlight everything in your notes. Because what that means is you're telling me I don't know what are the key terms, I'm not even sure what the subtopics are, and I really can't tell the difference between what's a main idea and what's not a main idea. So you've got to be somewhat selective when you do your note making in terms of your circling, underlining, and highlighting. Now, before we get on to the essential question down here at the bottom, and there's a reason why it's the bottom of the page, one of the things we're going to do sort of simultaneously with our note making is we're going to do connections. And connections are those things that go in the left-hand margin. That's why your left-hand margin has to be a little bit wider than that pink line, 2 to 3 times the size, to have room here. You can look at the Cornell interaction guide that's available in your toolbox, and you'll find directions for all of this, but it'll also have a list of 8 different connections that you can refer to that can go in this left-hand margin. So for instance, you could write the definition of one of those key terms that you've circled. Or you could draw a picture of a key term that you circled. Or what you could do is you could perhaps ask a question about some information that you've written here that you think is an important question. And there's a variety of different kinds of questions you can ask. There's going to be anywhere from 3 to 5 connections per page. So in your note taking here, as you've written it, you might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different connections that you've written in the left-hand margin. You need to pay attention in class for directions that are given as to how many connections or what type of connections perhaps you should use. And I say what type because as we see the Cornell Note Interaction Guide on the next page, what you're going to notice is there's 8 of them and they are numbered. So you can actually refer to those 8 and I can say, well, do 2 number 2s and 3 number 3s and at least 1 number 4. And that way you'll have an idea of what things are supposed to go on that left-hand margin. Now, when you turn your paper over, let's say your notes go beyond the first page. When you turn your paper over, your margin's going to be on the other side, isn't it? It's not going to be a left-hand margin with your notes going on the right-hand side. Now it's going to be a right-hand margin and your notes going on the left-hand side, and that's okay. Don't worry about where that margin is. Just make sure there is a large margin to do your connections in. And it needs to be on every page, front and back, every page. So it's important that you are following those directions because, again, you can notice here, there's quite a bit of points. There's up to 20 points possible just for these steps here. Now, at the very end of your notes is where you put the answer to the essential question. This goes at the end of the notes, not the bottom of the page. I know traditional Cornell note paper has a little summary section at the bottom of the page. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But we are going to take notes all the way down to the bottom of the page, onto the back side of a page, and when we get to the end of our notes, that's when the answer to the essential question comes. It doesn't go at the bottom of the last page. It goes at the end of the notes. And when you write your answer to the essential question, you need to write it as you would write a BCR. And again, refer to your toolbox in your notebook, because there are directions about writing a BCR, a brief constructed response. The idea that if the question up here is, why was George Washington the father of his country? And we took notes on that. When you answered the essential question, you'd say George Washington was the father of his country because, and then you would pull information out of your notes to answer the question in a paragraph. In a paragraph. Now, that's worth 5 points. At each one of these stages, you can get partial credit. You might not have all the notes, partial credit. You might not have circled all the key terms, or maybe you didn't highlight all the main ideas in all the sections. Less than 5 points. You maybe only did half the number of connections that you're supposed to. Less than 5 points. You may have written a rather poor, or maybe a not very thorough, or maybe an inaccurate answer to the essential question. Less than 5 points. And so you can see where you could get something like 15 points out of 20, 10 points out of 20. Or simply just lose a big chunk of points because you did all your note taking, but you didn't do any note making. You didn't answer the essential question. You did not do the connections. And the result is that you get very few points for your notes. Now, how do you get 30? Well, one of the things about Cornell notes is sometimes those notes might go on for 3, 4, 5 pages. And in that situation, there'll be times when I say, let's pause here. We've covered kind of a major chunk of information that's kind of interrelated. Let's pause here, and what I want you to do is I want you to write a summary smack dab in the middle of your notes. And you're going to write a summary of the section of notes before that. And what you're going to do then is say, put it in a box with a highlighter, and I'll tell you what to do. And then that particular summary might be worth 2 points. And if we have several of those, you might end up with something around 30 points. So you can see then how it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 points-ish. It just depends on what we do with our notes. But at the minimum, 20 points for Cornell notes. Now, I've referred to this Cornell Note Interaction Guide, and I've talked about the fact that you've got a toolbox in your notebook. It's important that you actually see what that paper looks like. So this is the paper that I'm talking about. And if you look at this paper carefully, what it actually has on it is it has a division. So we talked about that left-hand margin. Imagine there's a left-hand margin right here. Notice how now the connections are on the left-hand side. And so these are the numbers for the different connections. And there are a total of 8 of them here that can be used by students. And then on the right-hand side, it says this is where your note-taking goes. And then it talks about these steps for following these steps for note-taking. And then it says, well, you're going to do some note-making. Let's remember to follow the steps for note-making. And then there's some reminders down here. And then there's also the reminder about the essential question here. So this set of information, this Cornell Note Interaction Guide, is available both on my website as well as in your notebook. And so it's important that you're referring to this. In addition to this, in your notebook, there is a Cornell Note Interaction checklist. What that means is it's a series of steps, and it says, did you do this? Did you do that? And it goes through each of the things that are supposed to be in your notes, and you use that just to make sure that you're not losing points on your notes. But if you're doing all this correctly, and it's not just about getting points, It's not just about doing this busy work. It's about every time you read through your notes, you have this reminder of the content of the notes. Every time you're doing more connections, you're reminded more deeply of the content of the notes. And the result is that you're remembering more and more and more of those notes. In addition to that, you can take your paper and along that margin that you created on the left-hand side, you can make a fold. And if you fold this over to the back and you leave your notes on one side and the connections on the other, you can literally quiz yourself. You can read the connections in the left-hand margin, and then you try and recall the information that's in your notes. Or you can have somebody read the connections that are in the left-hand margin, and then you, from memory, taking from your notes, respond to that connection or explain it. And so in this way, it becomes a study tool that you can use to study your notes. Now you might say, well, I'll do this, in this class, but over my other class, thus and such a class, whatever it might be, they don't require us to do this, and so I'm not going to do that over there. But why wouldn't you? I mean, if you need to remember that information as much as you need to remember information in my class, why wouldn't you use Cornell notes in every class? Why wouldn't you do connections in the margin of your notes in every class? And that's really an important concept. Because one of the things that I've found is whether it is because I'm taking notes myself because I'm at a professional learning development kind of thing as a teacher through the school district, or it's because I'm reading a book, a history book, or a book just to enjoy on my own time, I find myself doing these connections in the margins of my book or in my notes. I find myself underlining and highlighting and circling and so on. I'm doing it quite naturally. Because what I'm doing is I'm interacting with the notes. I'm interacting with the text. And when I do that, I remember more. And when I do that, I can also refer back to my notes, back to my textbook, whatever book I'm reading, and I can quickly find those things that I knew were important at the time, or that I knew were important shortly thereafter, and therefore I can remember them. If you have any questions about this, it's really important that you very quickly come to me and ask in class. The first time you get your notes back, if there's something that's missing, come and ask. What is it that I did wrong if you don't understand? I try and make it very clear when you lose points why you lost points. But if you're still not understanding why, make sure that you're asking me so that you can get the help that you need so that these notes can be done properly so you don't lose points on them and so that you can begin to make those connections and really build that understanding of the things we discuss in class.